Hey guys, I'm Will from Tested, and today I'm here at Prizefighter Bar in Emeryville, California with Adam Rogers, who's the writer of Proof. I'm holding in my hand. It's The Science of Booze. He's also an editor, articles editor at Wired. Thanks for coming down and joining us, Adam.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm always happy for an excuse to come to Prizefighter.
So you wrote, you wrote Proof. It's a book that's totally about science of booze. I thoroughly enjoyed it over the last, let's say, 7 days.
Thank you.
And, you know, I came into this feeling like I knew a fair amount about how most booze was made. I've made a little bit of beer, made a little bit of wine, stuff like that. But I learned a ton, starting with really yeast.
Yeah.
It's funny because yeast, like I didn't think about it before, but yeast is kind of the hero, the protagonist of a book about the science of booze.
Yeah, it's true. I guess I didn't think of it. I didn't think of it that way. Although it is the case that the yeast does recur. I mean, what I wanted to do was structure a book about alcohol in a kind of different way than most alcohol books are structured. So usually, you know, people will write these books and separate them, organize them by categories, right? Which is a perfectly good heuristic.
You mean vodka, gin,
yeah,
and all the way down to the brown liquors at the far end of the spectrum.
Exactly so. Or there's a great book, The Drunken Botanist, that's all about the plants that people use to make into alcohol, and it goes plant by plant, you know, essentially. And I wanted to do something that was more of what I started to think of as a process arc. Was like, okay, well, you start with yeast, this, you know, an invisible microbe that's been fermenting, that's been doing this process that we use for 150 million years.
But something that we didn't know existed, aside from its effects, until what,
until the 1860s.
150 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. So we used it without knowing what it was or what it did. It was magic, essentially.
Alchemy.
Right? Yeah. And then going to the sugar that the yeast eats as a substrate. So all these things have sugar in them, from grapes to apples to agave, right? All these things have sugar in some form or another.
Barley, all of it, yeah.
Exactly. And then sort of moving to like, all right, well, so you can ferment that, you can distill that, you can age what you've distilled, then you taste it, right? Then you feel its effects on your body. And so I realized that was the path I wanted to take. And almost anything that you drink follows some number of those steps. You know, you could set out, I've been playing with a flight of grape juice, wine, pisco, and a brandy, for example, which are all basically the same thing, right? It's
different stages along the way.
At different stages along the way, exactly. So that's the arc of the book. And the pivot point, the exact middle of the book, only metaphorically, it doesn't really happen in the middle of the book, because it happens in the beginning, but the metaphoric middle of the book that everything balances on is that moment when you sit down in a bar and somebody gives you a drink and you take a sip. So 150 million years of evolution and 10,000 years of science and 2,000 years of technology behind that, and all of our anatomy and biology in front of that. There's that one middle point where you take a sip of a drink.
And so when did you decide to write the book? Like, were you sitting in a bar and had an epiphany that, that you might as well make this some productive time instead of just recreational?
A guy walks into a bar, and here's what happened. I wrote a feature for Wired about trying to solve the mystery of a fungus that lives on whiskey fumes.
This happened in Canada?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was like, I guess, 2011 that I wrote the story. And while I was reporting the story and talking about it with friends and colleagues and finding out all this kind of interesting ancillary stuff about how booze gets made and consumed, I was at a dinner and I was talking about that with three really of the preeminent science writers of our time, with Carl Zimmer and Bill Wasik, who's a colleague, and Thomas Getz, who at the time was the executive editor at Wired, and I was talking to them about what I was finding for this article, and at the same time, all three of them said, that's a book. And I said, which part? And Bill said, well, all of it, the whole thing.
I mean, it's a story about yeast and fungus, and the yeast part is fascinating.
Yeah, it turns out.
The story of yeast is fascinating.
It turns out. And then I realized, when I sort of started looking into it and trying to figure out what the structure of that book would be, that I had in fact been saving research material for that book for years without knowing that's what I was doing. That I visited distilleries in Scotland in the mid-90s, and then I'd done the same thing in Kentucky, that I had been collecting every article that I could find from journals on booze and just sort of tucking it away in manila folders in my file cabinet at home, that I'd been keeping this string for a long time. And so when I figured out a structure, I realized I already had a lot of the information for it.
So you could just, at that point, it's just sitting down and writing the actual book.
Yeah. Simple.
It's no problem.
No problem.
We've all done that.
Let's do it.
With yeast, the interesting thing about yeast is we domesticated it, it domesticated us at the same time. It's a mutually beneficial relationship for humans who like to get drunk.
Sure.
And this microscopic organism that's essentially just a fungus like any of thousands or hundreds of thousands of others. And following that, like you start out by talking about the origins of that relationship. Whether it's the probably apocryphal story of the lions that are in the African savannah underneath the grape tree where the grapes fell into the pond and the lions came and drank the water. And what's the actual origin of the yeast? Do we know?
Well, no. The oldest evidence of people doing fermentation, what's considered to be pretty solid,
like intentional fermentation.
That's right. It is about 10,000 years old, 9 or 10,000 years old. It could be older. We might just have not found it. Right? Archaeology is tough.
Right.
There are examples in nature of animals either mostly accidentally getting drunk, eating something that fermented on the vine.
Whether it was a piece of fruit or...
Yeah.
Okay.
It's controversial whether animals seek that out or not. Other animals besides us.
Right.
But, the thing that fascinates me about this is less when we first kind of tried to domesticate, to tame this process, and more the idea that it was going on for millions of years before human beings were ever around. Yeah. That it is this thing that happens outside us that we then grabbed. And when we grabbed it, that was one of the first times that we were doing science, right? That we started doing agronomy, that we started breeding plants to be more useful for that process. We became, to me, the argument I'm trying to make in the book, to the extent that there's an argument that follows all the way through it, is that that's when we started to become people, when we started to become scientists.
It was the beginning of technology and the beginning of science at the same time. But the interesting thing to me about yeast is because we didn't know that yeast was what we were taming.
Right.
It kind of, unlike the dog, where you breed a white dog and a black dog and you get a black dog with white spots or a white dog with black spots, with the yeast we just know that, this stuff that we made with the yak's milk tasted better than this stuff that we made with the yak's milk.
That's right, or the wine from that vineyard on that hill tastes better than the wine from that vineyard on that hill, and we think they're the same grapes, but something's different, we don't know what, but we're going to keep buying the wine from that one and not from that one, right? So that's that domestication process. That's where we're deciding, voting with our palates, basically.
And market forces shape the domestication and the evolution of the yeast in a way that kind of hasn't with the other stuff directly.
That's the theory.
Okay.
I mean, that's the hypothesis, right? Like, nobody's really sure. And a lot of the history of this science is hard to figure out because the records aren't there, because it happened before there was history. You start to figure out more once you get into kind of ancient Greece, into Rome. The Romans were big into wine. The Phoenicians are probably the ones who figured out barrels for transporting this stuff, maybe.
At least they were the ones that had the tools to make the barrels, right?
Right. So, you begin to at least see you see it starting to come up in history, but that early prehistory, you're relying on some very difficult analytical chemistry of some very, very old residue in pots.
People literally taking a pottery shard, running it through a spectroscopy.
That's right,
and
among other tests.
Right, and finding trace elements that typically were used in fermentation
and
sealing.
And the tricky bit is that you don't find the ethanol, so you're always inferring, because ethanol is volatile. Ethanol is evanescent and wants to evaporate. That's why you can do distilling, right? Those properties are important later. But when for example, Patrick McGovern is the researcher at Penn who has done a lot of this work in early fermentation, and he has this shard from a site called Jiahu in China, 9 or 10,000 years old, and what he found in that was beeswax, which you only get from honey, residue from rice, and tartaric acid, which any other time in any other place you would have said was grapes, but not there from that period of time in China. So he suspects that it's from hawthorn, which is, he describes it, it's a fruit like a chalky apple, he says. And so if you mix those things together, ambient yeast,
the yeast that's on the skin of the fruit,
or the yeast that's in the air around us settles on it. It's hard to keep that from fermenting, would be his point. Like if you want to make mead out of honey today, right? You just mix honey and water and you let it sit. Like it ferments, it wants to. So his argument is, look, first of all, why would you mix that stuff together if you weren't going to ferment it? And if you mix that stuff together, it would ferment. That's what would happen. And it's kind of the Mother Eve of booze, right? It's got the mead that we think of as being made in honey. It has rice that you would think of as a sake, probably, right? Although there's older versions of that from China, and fruit for wines and brandies. So this kind of is this first mixture then spreads out, and diversifies genetically into what we think of as drinks today.
At this point, we have a massive, fast forward a few thousand years.
Right, sure.
We have a fairly large industry around making all kinds of booze, beer, wine, sake, whiskey, other distillates. Yeast is a thing that evolves naturally. How does the master brewer at a brewery, at a distiller in Scotland or in a brewery in California, keep that yeast the same over hundreds of years that they've been making scotch in the Highlands of Scotland?
Right. So this is, even now, kind of controversial in the world of brewers and distillers. So brewers will have a lot of loyalty to a particular strain of yeast, which is tricky because yeast wants to mutate. Yeast is really genetically unstable. It shares genes with other yeast around it, and
one of the things that makes it easy to domesticate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the things that makes it interesting in a lab setting, for example. I mean, it's slightly different versions of the same species of yeast are the model organism for eukaryotes, right? Mm-hmm. It's the basis for a lot of biotechnology, for biochemistry, for biology. So brewers will go back to the same place again and again and buy the same strain. And the way those strains are stored typically is they'll have a sample and they'll keep it frozen. They keep it at suspended animation, basically.
So liquid nitrogen bath,
that's
the whole
right.
thing? Okay.
Or you can also desiccate it and powder it, right? And keep it cold.
Okay.
And then when somebody orders more of it, you'll grow up some from that original batch. So you grow that up, send it out.
Okay.
Right. What you don't want to do is just keep the yeast kind of alive and bubbling in a pot.
Like your sourdough starter in your fridge, right?
Yeah, and the reason sourdough starters will stay stable largely is that they are they're the wild type yeast that's dominant. Right, so they're the one that's around, which is why if you take a sourdough starter from one place and go somewhere else, if you move across the country, if you go from your little house on the prairie in the Midwest out to California, you go from making a nice kind of sweet tasting bread into something sour, because we've got also the lactic bacteria here, but you don't make San Francisco sourdough bread anywhere but San Francisco because of what lives here. And similarly, Belgian lambics are a beer style made typically with wild yeast. And those brewers are very, very careful to keep their environmental conditions the same so that they get the same kind of yeast falling into these big shallow fermentation pools.
And brewers and distillers are kind of a superstitious lot, it seems like. I mean, to the point that you had tons of examples throughout the book of people building another building on top of their existing brew house.
Right. But the distillers, some of them don't agree. Some of them think that yeast is just another commodity because they've got such larger quantities, they have such high heat, and so some of them don't care that much. And others do. Others think, no, we have our yeast strain and we're very careful with it. But then the distillers have other, superstitions is probably strong. The distillers have other things that they think are critical to the product that they make, right? So for a distiller of Scotch whiskey, of single malt whiskey in Scotland, it's the shape of the still that has to be the same every time. And stills have a lifespan of about 20 or 30 years, and when you replace the still, the same coppersmith, guys probably from Forsyths, come in and they have the specs from the one that they built you 30 years ago and the one 30 years before that and the one 30 years before that, and they build, it's like, oh yeah, make sure to put in that one ding on the side because that's what makes your whiskey taste like your whiskey.
So do you think that's true?
I think certainly the gross shape of the still has a huge effect.
Just in the fact the rates at which stuff falls out and precipitates out.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The tall skinny ones at Glenmorangie or the kind of shorter, stubbier ones at, I'm making this up, at Springbank, let's say. The shorter ones mean that molecules get over the top more easily, right? Whereas a tall one means that the molecules need more energy so that the heavier ones sort of go up and then sink back down into the mix, have to get cooked more, so different things come out at different rates. Distillation fundamentally is a separation technology, right? Just like centrifugation or filtration or gas chromatography to some extent, right? Based on charge, or gel electrophoresis you do for DNA. Distillation separates molecules based on their evaporation pressure, based on volatility, right? And so timing that and figuring out how much energy you're going to put into the system and figuring out which of those molecules, which set of molecules you want, which usually in the middle, not the ones that come off first and not the ones that come off last.
The heads and the tails?
That's right. So the heads you use to clean things, that's,
brake cleaner and
that's right.
Okay.
That's toxic.
Okay.
And the tails tend to have stuff that we don't like the taste of. But so there's this art in the cut. So if you're using a pot still, if you're doing single malt style distilling, Scottish style distilling, the cut is, okay, when do we decide that we've gone from the heads to the hearts, right? And now we're going to keep this. And then when do we decide that we're going to keep some of the tails because there's a lot of flavor in there. So figuring out how much of that is what makes a master distiller a master distiller.
So, when they're figuring that, is that something that, I mean, obviously now there's a lot of instrumentation and there's a little bit of science involved. In the, 200 years ago, was the old guy with the beard just standing there with his hand on the lever and kind of eyeballed it and looked at the right time?
Part of the way was time and alcohol content, because you can specifically, using a hydrometer, you can specifically tell how much what's the ethanol content, and you learn. Okay. So that's what you standardize to. You say, well, when the ethanol content gets here, that's when we're going to switch it over, and it's going to go into the tank, right?
The keeper vat instead of in the brake cleaner.
Exactly.
Vat. Okay.
Right. And then when it gets here, that's when we're going to switch it back, and we're not going to keep it anymore. And then we're probably going to run that and some other stuff through the still again, because we're trying to get a more specific cut, right? We take a kind of a gross pass and then a fine pass. It's a little bit different with a column still, like you would see in American whiskey making in a big distillery. It's a slightly different process, but essentially uses the height of the column. And you pick, this is the level that we're going to take it out. We put in the stuff, the fermented stuff from the top, steam from the bottom. They all pass by each other, and we take things out kind of about where we want it. And then probably run it through again for a finer cut, or through a different still that does it a slightly different way. But you would do that by eye and by ear and by nose and by taste the first few times, right? However many times you needed to get it right. The instrumentation doesn't look for those other things. That's not what they're using. But in the early, probably so in the beginning of distilling for drinks. They really just wanted to get to the alcohol, and they would flavor it with stuff. So it's a little bit different than making whiskey, let's say. You think about whiskey, and you've got this grain product, essentially beer, and you're taking this beer and you're distilling it to get whiskey, and you're trying to get the right flavors out of that you can then age to mix with the flavors that you get out of the wood, and time that changes those molecules as well, because you get more chemistry over time, and that's what you're getting out. But like the stuff that they were making, the medical school in Bologna, where Taddeo Alderotti first wrote his book about how to distill for medicinal purposes, right? Right. That was a high-proof spirit flavor with herbs, essentially. So you get it's sort of a way to think about it would be like herb-flavored vodka. And you can still, maybe, I mean, this is sort of speculative, but you can taste examples of those now. Like we still have some of those. Chartreuse. Oh, really? Right, or Benedictine. Okay. Are probably, kind of like what they were, if not in the 1200s, then maybe in the 1600s. In the same ballpark, at least. Yeah. Okay. And you can go like, oh, I see. So, and if you taste those, if you've ever had those before, they're very herbal, very potent. Like super gin. More so? Yeah, that's an interesting comparison. The thing about gin, of course, is characteristically that is flavored with juniper. Right. So these might have had that, but you'll get flavors, but botanical flavored stuff. And they were meant to be medicines. Imagine the miracle of one of these guys who claims to be a doctor, who for hundreds of years, for thousands of years, these people have really never been right more often than chance. All of a sudden coming to you with a liquid that actually makes you feel different and sometimes better, right? Like what? It's amazing. Like it's the first time you go like, oh, wait a minute, I actually feel different now than I did before I drank this. Like objectively, I feel different. I'm in. This sounds great. Let's keep trying this stuff. So we have the yeast. The next thing is the thing that gets fermented. Where does the sugar come from? And human ingenuity has given us probably hundreds, maybe thousands of things that if it has sugar, somebody has fermented it and drunk it. Yes, I think that is probably safe to assume. Okay, so grapes, obviously, and other kind of soft-skinned fruit are easy because they have the sugar readily accessible. It's all monosaccharides. But then you get to the more complex stuff like rice and grains, where you have a starchy layer that the yeast can't do anything with. How did we develop malting, and how do we figure it out? How do we figure that stuff out? Well, so the issue is just as you and I, unless you're a superhero, cannot digest cellulose, right? Nope, not so much. Which is a polysaccharide. It's sugar molecules joined together in a certain way, but can digest starch. We have amylase, starch enzyme in our saliva, among other things. Yeast are stuck. Yeast can only digest the simplest of sugars. So how do you get, if your agricultural product is a grain, like rice or barley. Where most of the sugar is tied up in starches. Exactly. Where they've bound it up, because those seeds, like barley corns, those seeds are basically, they're like plant version of eggs. They're little bombs of life. They've got an embryo, and they've got the equivalent of a yolk, which is the starch. And when the growth process starts, those seeds make enzymes that break that starch into sugars that the embryo can use to grow and turn into a plant. So how do we take that process over? The origin of malting, right? Like, when do they start doing that? How do they figure that out? Well, you begin to see it because it looks an awful lot like making, grits or polenta or oatmeal or something. Like, you sort of cook it for a while, and you see it and you get a change.
Well, you can tell it starts to get soft. Right?
That's right, and sweeter
as
well. The way they do that in the yeast, rather than the malting process, which is basically beginning the process of germination of your seeds and then arresting that process, and because the enzymes get started and you can get access to the enzymes. So in Eastern countries, Asian countries, China and Japan, they actually use a separate fungus. So yeast is one fungus. In those countries they use koji, this other fungus, and the first time that shows up, which makes the amylases that you need. So they'll infect the rice.
So basically it pre-digests the rice so that the yeast can come through and pull the sugar out.
And it can work even in parallel, so you can have them happening at the same time.
Oh, that's good.
Which is one of the reasons that at least sake brewers will say that's why they can get alcohol contents higher. People used to think of sake as being very potent because we have 15% ABV or something. Now, of course, California red wines will get up to that, which is nuts. But because the koji is making the sugars that sometimes the yeast are digesting them and excreting. So
you never have the yeast; it doesn't hit the balance until a higher point. Okay,
notionally, right? But first mention of that is 300 BC. Of that process, right? So they're using it, and it's industrial. Even then, they're like, we have a big business making.
Here's
koji.
a big vat where we make koji, and then we sell the koji to the sake brewers, and then the sake brewers
we infect stuff with koji. We sell the spores, sprinkle it out in a shaker. But the origins of malting, I actually don't know, and I probably should press on that because that's fascinating, right? And that used to be something that in a distillery, they would do it by themselves, right? They would have a malting floor, and there'd be guys who would be in there controlling the temperature. They'd be using peat sometimes as the heat source to make it happen, and controlling that, turning it over, making sure that there was enough air in it, making sure it didn't spoil because it had to be wet, but you didn't want it too wet. Now, because they make such huge quantities, most of that malting is done in big centralized facilities, like the one that I visited for the book. So you just have this vast factory where 84 million tons of barley, 84 million pounds of barley a year, 8 trucks a day.
And then they ship it out all over the country.
And then they ship it back out to the distilleries, that's right.
So the other stuff that people ferment, I mean, there's a milk, horse milk, cow's milk.
Mare's milk, right? It has to be from, that's kumis, that's Central Asian steppes.
Okay.
It's apparently only horse milk has sugar levels, lactose, high enough that the yeast will have anything to do with it. So you can't really ferment cow's milk. It goes bad first. Okay. Mare's milk you can. I never had it. Apparently it's terrible, but
sounds like it would not be something you might seek out after the first try.
I'd love to try it. Palm wine, Africa and India, they'll take palm sap and use mostly ambient yeasts. So they get very, you get biofilms. They get very sticky. You get kind of
like
snotty layers
top on the top.
Yeah. Okay. And a lot of fatty flavors in those. Apparently, I read somebody describe it as that it tasted like alligator fat. Like it's a really kind of
very specific.
Vile. That's very specific. Yeah. And how would you know that?
Well, alligators are tasty. They taste like chicken. We talked about distilling. You talk about craft brewing a little bit. The craft brewing revolution that happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in the US kind of opened up a whole world of exploration. Yeah. And we went from having, 4 or 7 breweries or something like that in the United States to having hundreds and now thousands. And it seems like that's starting to happen with distilleries. The regulations have opened up a little bit, and some things are changing.
That's what the distillers hope, for sure. In craft distilling, I think you've seen a boom. The curve, and even the numbers, the curve looks an awful lot like the curve that craft brewing followed.
Just in the number of distilleries.
Yeah, in the early, sort of, the years following when Fritz Maytag opened Anchor Brewing in San Francisco, right? Which was really kind of one of the, if not the, turning.
Right, it was that or New Albion, depending on who you ask, right?
Yes, okay, sure. And then you start to see things like Boston making Sam Adams, and then now it's on, right? And now as you say, now you have a world where when you travel in the United States, really almost if you were in anything from a small size city and up, and you go into a decent restaurant, you can order the local. And it's great, right? And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's fine, sometimes it's not, but you're always having something interesting that's local.
A constant search for new flavors.
Yeah, that's
as opposed to just, does the Budweiser here taste different than the Budweiser in where I'm from?
Just so.
Right.
And it is now the case that is beginning to happen with spirits. It's a little bit different because the transition from somebody who is a home brewer to a craft brewer to somebody who like gives a growler of what he or she makes to all of his or her friends at the holidays to like, I should start selling this stuff, is a much clearer path than it is for somebody who's distilling at home, because it's still basically illegal to distill at home. So you have to either be illicit or you have to talk yourself into an apprenticeship at some place that has a TTB license. You know, it's a little bit harder, and that's changing.
And there's some like equipment differences. Like setting up your own still is I brewed beer at home in my linen closet, right?
Right.
I had a 5-gallon tub, and I had all the stuff that I used to cook normal food. It wasn't any big investment other than a bottle capper and a hygrometer. To make a still in your backyard
a little harder.
Seems a little more involved.
A little harder, although there are, you know, swaths of this country where that has been part of the culture since before there was this country, right? So people have done it. This past week I was just in Washington, D.C., and one of the people who I got to spend some time with was a guy named Michael Lowe, who runs a distillery called New Caledonia. They make a bunch of gins. They're very good. It's the first distillery in Washington, D.C. in 100 years. And you know, that's the local gin. And if you go to the bars, because DC has kind of a burgeoning cocktail scene now too, people are making cocktails with the local gin, which is exciting, right? It's nice to go to a city and see like, oh yeah, that's the local. And we're a little bit spoiled in the Bay Area, right? I mean, forget about all the Bay Area. Let's just talk about my neighborhood in the East Bay, right? Which has, depending on how you define neighborhood, has within walking distance of my house, a sake brewery, 3 beer breweries, including Trumer and Pyramid, a couple of wineries, and a couple of meaderies, right? And if you spread the circle wider, you've got St. George Spirits in Alameda, which I think is one of the great craft distillers and helped start in the same way that Anchor helped start the beer thing. Right. Start there, plus the distillery at Anchor, plus in California you still have Germain Robin and Oso Callis. Go farther north, you've got Clear Creek in Oregon. Like this is really so are there a lot of them? I don't know, but there are some good ones. Like that's the amazing thing is that I can name, you know, half a dozen small distilleries making brilliant stuff.
And what is a small distillery? Is what, a few thousand cases a year, probably?
Yeah, and those definitions probably change from association to association. Yeah, I mean, I guess probably in my head, I think of maybe regional distribution and smaller numbers, as you say, versus someplace like, you know, Jack Daniel's, which basically makes an ocean of whiskey every year.
So in the beer equivalent, it would be somewhere bigger than your local brew pub, but smaller than, you know, 21st Amendment is the example I would give. Locally distributed, regionally distributed, but hard to get outside.
21st Amendment's a good example too, of course, because that goes from being a brew pub to now like you can get 21st Amendment stuff in a lot of places.
In cans at the grocery store.
That's right, which is terrific.
So it seems like the distilleries are at a place, they're experimenting, they're trying new stuff, they're bringing things that weren't popular back. It seems like a really good time to be making local liquor.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that it's the beginning, so it's exciting. And so there are places where you'll taste the local, whatever the local spirit is, and if it's not, it might not be to your liking, right? But it's still cool that there's something local that you can try. You're not drinking national brand. I would say here's a thing that is not parallel to the craft brewing movement.
Okay.
Just to be really simplistic about it, the reason the craft brewing movement happened was that the national beer brands didn't taste good.
Or they had gotten, they taste good for what they are.
That's better, yes.
Right, but they don't serve a wide variety of interests.
Yeah, that's a better way to put it. Nobody doesn't like a cold can of Budweiser under certain circumstances.
Budweiser's the one I would give you the
I mean, we'll go Coors, let's say.
Yeah, Coors is good.
Which you know is able to make a huge amount of consistently flavored product all the time, and sometimes that's great. But because they were making so much of it, it became necessarily average, right? It regressed to the mean.
Right.
That I would argue is not actually the case with spirits. I would argue that Wild Turkey, for all of making an ocean of Wild Turkey every year, is delicious. Like it's very good. It's a very good bourbon. You know that Jack Daniel's, right? Tennessee Sour Mash, whatever, is delicious.
I'll drink Jack Daniel's all day long.
Right?
I mean, not all day long. That doesn't work.
It's not good for you. But you see what I mean.
Yeah.
That the response is not so much to the flavor of what we have or to the way that what they're making what we have, but to broaden, to get into, to find niches or to find success in making things that aren't there. I mean, put aside the brown liquor, Beefeater as a gin is a terrific gin. You know, and so if you're making a local gin, if you're a small gin maker, you have to very consciously be saying to yourself, what am I going to do because I'm going to charge more than Beefeater by kind of a lot, probably. So what am I going to do? What's my value proposition? What am I doing better? What am I doing differently than Beefeater does?
Novelty won't cut it.
Right, and just being local won't cut it, honestly. Because if people are going into a bar and ordering a gin and tonic, the first time they'll order you as a gin and tonic, but if it's much more expensive and tastes, doesn't taste as good, they'll go back to Beefeater, and as well they should, right? Because it's good gin or whatever. Like I use Beefeater as an example because it's my go-to, but whatever.
Bombay, whatever you like.
Sure. That means that the craft distillers have to be that much better than they would otherwise, and some of them are.
So you have, it seems like a lot of what sells booze, it makes me want to drink beer, wine, whatever, is the story. Like we have on one side these massive international conglomerates that move, like you said, oceans of bourbon, vodka, gin, whatever, a year. And on the other hand, you have the little guys who are working in a garage down in Alameda or South of Market or wherever, kind of cranking out their best product. And like that story, at least to me, speaks a lot. I don't like drinking the product of the faceless multinational. No. I like to drink the thing the guy down on the other side of the street makes.
Yeah, that probably explains why the faceless multinationals will market to tradition and history and old guys in the back country with stills kind of stuff.
At the same time, they have, what was it? You said the Kentucky bourbon distilleries have a sewage treatment plant control center.
Yeah, basically. I mean, they really, it is.
Yeah.
I mean, now they are controlled by guys who have been doing it for decades and talk like they would still be in the back country.
Sons.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit I'm a little bit on the fence about the theater of it because I like the theater. I mean, my palate for wine is only okay, but I love it when they give you the big glass and they make a deal out of decanting it and seasoning the decanter and the sommelier checking for you and that kind of stuff. I love that, and it does make for the experience. It does make the experience better and more fun, which really does make it taste better. Like you will report the stuff tasting better.
There's science behind it.
Yes, like that is what the research shows. Your experience of what you are drinking, the surround, affects how you perceive the flavor.
Well, the bar is an old piece of mahogany. It makes the bourbon taste better.
Yeah, I mean, here's my personal example of that is I bought, after coveting them for decades, I finally bought 2 of the glasses that Harrison Ford drinks whiskey out of in Blade Runner. Those square cut crystal. Yeah. You can buy them. They still make them.
Somebody makes them, yeah.
Yeah. So I finally got my mom to buy them for me for my birthday. And I tweeted. I said, I know that these won't make the whiskey taste better, but yes, they will. And it is the single thing that has been the most retweeted of anything I ever put on Twitter. It spread far and wide because I think people felt that, they're like, yeah, it does. Like that, the conditions of the experience make it seem better.
The first time I got a set of Imperial pints with the bulge.
Oh yeah,
the beer is better.
Got better.
The beer is definitely better.
Got way better. And so so much so in fact that if you're studying the effects of alcohol, right, there are a few places now in this country where the researchers have simulated a bar, where they built a bar in their laboratories with bar stools and bottles behind and music
neon lights,
and
the whole
lights,
thing.
because what people expect to feel, what people think they're going to feel about their drinking changes the effects of the alcohol.
So I mean, part of this argues against the kind of wine tasting hoodoo and the master sommelier test, where the tester has to taste dozens and dozens of wines and identify the region, varietal, and vintner. But on the other side of it, there's actually some science that shows that people's noses and taste buds combined make this unbelievable, quantitative instrument.
Yeah. Now, I would say my understanding of the sommelier thing is that that's memory at work, right? Where you're developing a sense memory where you remember, you're like, oh yeah, I know what that is.
Like a chef collects taste profiles.
Yeah.
The sommeliers collect wine.
But that actually is, in some senses, and now I'm being a bit speculative, in some senses that's different than me identifying a flavor as smoky and you identifying it as smoky, right? There's an object metaphor problem there where we're trying to put into words something that doesn't exist in words in our heads.
We don't have a shared, I know what smoky tastes like, you know what smoky tastes like. What you think of smoky might be mesquite because you grew up in the Southwest.
Yeah.
What I think of smoky might be hickory because I grew up in the Southwest.
Yeah, that's a really good way to think about it. And in fact, so you might dive into the philosophical problem of color, let's say. Is your red the same as my red? But in fact, we have an objective standard for red. We can pick a number of nanometers as a frequency of on the visual spectrum and say, look, that's red. And whether you say that's red and I say that's red doesn't really matter.
Here's a card that a machine tells us is red.
Yeah, that's right. Here's a thin slice through the prism. You know, that doesn't exist for aroma, right? People have tried for centuries. People have tried to come up with an aroma spectrum, and you can't do it. The thing about smell that I love the most, I mean, it is our most, in many respects, our most direct scent. Everything else, our most direct sense. Everything else that we perceive is mediated by something in our body, by sets of neurons, by pigments in the eye for color, stuff like that. But you know, when you smell something, little pieces of that thing are floating through the air, going into your nose, and touching little projections from your brain up right back there.
Much more terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, yes, right? Like that is your brain touching the thing you are smelling. It's afferent projections of neurons coming down through a plate right below your eyeballs. And it's super direct and super tied into your emotional state, tied into memory. So if you're trying to study it, as they do at places like UC Davis, for example, you have to account for all of that. You have to kind of get a group together, and everybody has to train up together and learn together. We're all going to agree what apple-y is. If I say apple and you say apple, we're all going to agree that's what we mean by apple. And once we've done that, then we're going to go taste some wine and try to identify.
So this setup that you're describing is super interesting. They take what, 18 people? I think you said.
Yeah, I can't remember. Hildegard Heyman's lab at UC Davis, and I don't remember what the number is, but it's let's say a dozen plus or minus.
And then they train them all on the same set of samples, so that you smell this, what does it smell like to you? I smell this, what does it smell like to you? You both describe it, and everybody comes to a consensus.
Well, then they go back, then they come in and they break that down. So if I say, this smells apple-y to me, and you say it, then they go back and come up with a bunch of different apple smells and say, do you mean this kind of apple? Do you mean this? Do you mean stewed apples? Do you mean Granny Smiths? Do you mean Fuji's? Do you mean applesauce? Do you mean, right, try all that, and then everybody goes, it's that one, it's that. This is our reference. This is apple.
And then once they've done that, then they have a group of people that have a shared language to describe definitively the same smells.
And then when they name something, it has statistical significance. Then you can start to do statistics on what they say when they smell something.
So then what do they do? Like, they take that and they feed them different kinds of wine and ask them for flavor profiles and stuff like that?
The research that I thought was the most interesting when I was doing the reporting for the book was, as an example, trying to understand terroir. Right, so in wine, there's this trait called terroir, which is the place where the grapes grew is having an impact on the grape.
So this side of the hill tastes different than the other side of the same hill.
That's right. This chalky soil is different than that non-chalky soil, that kind of stuff.
And some of that can be explained by microbial stuff, the different local yeast and microbes and stuff like that.
It is one of the great hypotheses that terroir is actually microbial terroir, or there is something there separately. There is microbial terroir, or it's there are molecules in the ground that get taken up into the plant and then that survive the fermentation process or survive the distilling process and make it into the drink.
But it could be something completely. It could be that there's a different kind of tree on the top of the hill and the runoff picks up stuff from the tree roots or whatever.
Exactly so. So one of the papers that came out of Hildegard Heyman's lab at UC Davis was taking juice from different regions, from I think even different continents, so South America and Australia. I think she just did it for only Australia too. I can't remember now. Just taking the juice, fermenting it themselves, like bringing it to the lab, because they have a winemaking lab.
Of course.
Like you do.
Davis has a big fermentation program.
That's right, sure, because of its locations here in California.
It's DAG school, all that stuff, yeah.
So they make the wine, so they don't have any variation, no variability in the way the wine was made. Now they have this wine, and same kind of grapes, right? So the only difference should be where it's grown, right? Now you've isolated that as an experiment, and now you can give it to people without telling them that's what you're testing, and say, try that one, what do you smell? Try that one, what do you smell? What are the aromas? What are you getting? What do you taste? And then plot it.
Because you have statistically measurable data that comes from people's noses.
Yeah, exactly. Correct.
And then also the gas chromatographs that have the face hoods on the end.
Yeah, so that's a little bit different, because with that, what you're trying to do is connect the measurable substances in the wine or in the whiskey or whatever to an aroma. To try to be able to say, oh, if we get a spike here with this long, unpronounceable organic chemical, that we can connect that to strawberry. We can connect that to leather. We can connect that to banana. And I'm naming those specifically because when I say them, right, I know what happens, right? Because you get you're like,
leather, strawberry,
I got it,
exactly.
right? You get bang, bang, bang. And in fact, that's a really mean trick you can play on people, by the way. If you're giving somebody something to drink for the first time, a glass of wine or anything, you can force it. You can say, like, when you taste this, you're going to taste strawberry. And they will, like, regardless of what it is.
It works with anything. You can do it with soda. You can say, oh, this is Crystal Pepsi, and give them a Sprite, and next thing you know, they're spinning it across the room.
It's super mean.
Yeah.
a thing that I'm trying to do now to get better about is when I give people something, they say, well, I want you to taste that. You taste it. You tell me what you think it tastes like, and then I'll tell you something about it. What they'll try to do with gas chromatography olfactometry is connect that. So you sit over the machine with a mask, and the things come through and spike, and you're supposed to name, usually from a list of possible words you can use to try to constrain your vocabulary, right? And try to identify, oh, that molecule makes it taste like this. And some things they know for sure. Diacetyl is a famous one. Mm-hmm. It smells like buttery popcorn. In most kinds of beer, that's considered to be an off flavor. The one for banana, which I can't remember now, but is another famous one, which is an off flavor in almost all kinds of beer, except for Belgians, except for Hefeweizens, right, where you want it, right? You want that banana aroma. So if you're making that, you want it. And they know which molecule it is. But the thing is that what's becoming the people who study the sense of smell and taste are starting to come around to the notion that this is combinatorial. So there's multiple molecules in a certain order, perceived in a certain way, that are going to touch those. If
they hit receptors in different combinations, you get different.
Exactly.
So and there's mystery around this as well. I mean, people see things on the chromatograph that people can't smell. People smell things that don't show up on the chromatograph.
That's right.
And so it's a very poorly understood.
Yeah, it's one of the exciting places for research. You know, one of the things among my multiple goals in the book was I was trying to for me, that's the exciting part of science. When you get to the part where you can ask a researcher, what about this? And they go, we don't know yet. Mm-hmm. That's awesome, right? That's where the fun part is. That's what the scientists like.
Yeah.
You know, the stuff that they do know, that's solved. Or, you know, often, until somebody overturns it or falsifies it, right? And there are multiple key questions revolving around booze that researchers will still say, we just don't know yet. We're still working on it.
The last part of this is the hangover.
Yeah.
You drink too much, you have a good time. Everybody has a hangover story they tell. My mom explains the time that she found out that Cherry's Jubilee have alcohol in them.
That's a bad thing to be hungover
horrible.
on.
I had the worst hangover of my life the morning I asked my wife out on our first date. You know,
at least it worked out.
It worked out. I fell downstairs and bad things happened, but everything's fine. We have a lovely daughter, and the whole thing worked out.
22% of people do not get hangovers.
So why is that?
Horrible
do we
people.
know?
Jerks.
So,
awful.
I always suspect, right? You always suspect that you're one of the people who doesn't get a hangover until you have one of the 2 or 3 worst hangovers of your life. Does anything fix them? Like, do we know what causes hangovers? I can ask 2 questions at once there. I'm going to ask you.
So I'll answer the second one first. No. It is not well understood what causes a hangover. All of those things they told you the first day before your first weekend of college about what causes hangovers are, at minimum, not proven, at most, not true.
Dehydration.
Not dehydration.
Brain case shrinkage.
It's not sugary drinks.
Okay.
It's not impure alcohol.
Beer before wine.
It's not mixing your alcohol. Oh. It's not, if I stick to vodka, I'll be fine. No, I mean, it's not congeners,
Is it
right?
ethanol toxicity?
Getting even more complicated, it's probably not acetaldehyde toxicity, though It's very hard to measure acetaldehyde in people's blood. It's probably not methanol toxicity, though if it was, that would be great, because then that would be an excuse to have the hair of the dog the next day, because ethanol displaces methanol off the enzyme that's breaking it down into formaldehyde and then formic acid, very bad for you. None of those things. So what is it? Well, part of the reason they don't know is that it's hard to figure out what causes a hangover if you don't really understand the mechanism for ethanol and why it makes you feel drunk, which they don't. It's the only recreational drug that humans take for which no mechanism has ever been articulated.
Most of the other stuff's pretty simple, right? Cannabinoids attached in a specific place, opiates attached in a different place.
Well, we call that simple because we got to figure it out.
Well,
yes, there are endogenous cannabinoid and opioid receptors in the brain, and so plants make these substances, and our brain is ready and willing, like, oh yeah, I know what these are. These make you do this, right? There is no endogenous ethanol receptor in the brain. What's the receptor? There's some ideas. Nobody's got it locked down. But part of the reason that they don't understand that is that really how the brain works is not completely well understood, right? I mean, like, if you really press on a neuroscientist, they would say, like, yeah, we got some questions still. We're working on it, right?
Well, and it kind of all affects everybody differently, right?
Yes, that's another problem. Yeah. How do you make sure that just as with color or with smell, how do we make sure that your hangover is the same as my hangover? And in fact, there wasn't even a reliable survey instrument that researchers were using until about a decade ago, where both of us could take the same test And then some other researcher could say, okay, he's got a hangover at 6, he's got a hangover at 9.
What does that test consist of?
Oh, it's a survey. You fill it out. Like, do you have the following symptoms and how bad?
How bad does your head hurt? Are your eyes fuzzy?
But I don't know what your hangovers are like. I wear mine in my guts, right? Like I have horrible GI hangovers. Okay. But I've never had a headache from a hangover.
Oh, see, I just have a bad headache, take some aspirin, I'm fine.
See that? Now, okay, so you said aspirin, and that's important because there have been studies that try different chemicals and see if they work.
To cure
a hangover.
Okay.
Based on the hypothesis that a hangover is an inflammatory response. So when your liver has an inflammatory response when it's trying to process alcohol. And there's some research that says, yeah, this looks inflammatory. Increased levels of cytokines, which are an inflammatory molecule that the immune system uses to talk to itself. If you administer immune system chemicals to a person, they report very hangover-like symptoms.
So we can replicate a hangover without alcohol.
Exactly. That's right. They also look a lot like migraines, so you can look at the brain of like the 5-HT receptors, serotonin receptors, and maybe that's a target. But inflammatory response. And there's a study using a drug called Clotam, which is kind of a superpowered anti-inflammatory. It's prescribed for migraines that did have a really good effect on hangovers. It's also not in the U.S. pharmacopoeia. You can't get it in the United States.
Great.
I tried a few routes that didn't work. There are some over-the-counter things out there that actually have been shown to have an effect.
Eastern solutions and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah,
right?
And so a couple of those, there's a molecule called dihydromercetin. It's derived from the Chinese pharmacopoeia that in studies has been shown to have an effect. It's sold as blue cetin, among other things. You can get it. Some other prickly pear cactus extract, pyritinol, which is a vitamin B6 thing.
That's the question.
All I have is anecdote, right? I mean, the studies say that yes, this had an impact. I've tried a bunch of them, and maybe, but don't listen to me. Like, what do I know, right? So, but if it's anti-inflammatory, you mentioned aspirin. You're like, well, there are anti-inflammatories, right? Unfortunately, all of those have their own side effects too. You take enough ibuprofen, and you've got some GI symptoms on their own, right? You got GI problems like gut bleeds,
right?
And acetaminophen has liver issues, and you already got a liver that's compromised with the booze. So, nobody has there's no solve, which is a bummer.
Drink water and drink a little bit less, maybe.
It's like war games. The only way to win is not to play.
Okay, so we touched on this. I get drunk. I have one set of very specific reactions. If I drink bourbon, I act like James Joyce in the late 18th century. Everybody kind of reacts a little bit differently, and it kind of can be affected even by your mood when you start drinking.
Yeah.
And this is anecdotal.
No, for sure.
Yeah.
As a recreational drug, nobody's ever really articulated solidly the mechanism for how ethanol affects the brain. It is the case that people have different reactions to drinking, and so intuitively you want to say, oh well, tequila makes me angry, bourbon makes me morose, vodka makes me creative, something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And no study's ever shown that. And in fact, it's hard to figure out what the other psychoactive chemicals in those different substances would be that would give a different effect, right? Some notions, histamines perhaps, right? But nobody's really ever shown that. What they have shown is that what affects the way alcohol is going to affect you is something called expectancies. What you were modeled as a kid, how you saw your parents act when they were drinking, if your parents drank in front of you. That will change what your reaction to alcohol are, whether it makes you promiscuous, whether it makes you voluble, whether it makes you angry. The only effect that some amount of alcohol has ever been shown to be consistent across cultures and across people is you get more violent behavior.
And that's at a demographic level, not at an individual level.
Yeah, that's right. Which is interesting because people think of illicit drugs as being violent, but of course for most illicit drugs, it's actually the market around the drugs that's violent. Though in the early days of this kind of research, people argued that in fact because they walked up to the argument that the effects were so different from culture to culture that in fact maybe ethanol didn't have any intrinsic effects at all. It was all what you brought to it. And people don't really make that case anymore, but there was a book in the 60s, I guess, called Drunken Comportment, which is one of the great titles of a fantastic book, that did a cross-cultural kind of ethnological study and walked right up to suggesting that in fact, it just depends on what you think is going to happen.
There was a Harvard medical student who volunteered for what seems like a very time-consuming and maybe invasive
I love this study. Yeah, turn of the century, turn of the last century, beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of office jobs, right? Basically everyone's drunk all the time. And so this lab in Boston, Carnegie Nutrition Lab builds out a facility for studying the effects of ethanol scientifically. And they don't have...
And not the nighttime events. They want to see if it's going to impact productivity the next day, or
yeah, I mean, essentially,
kind of the whole thing.
Yeah, they wanted to know would you still be able to type? In fact, one of their metrics, one of the things they tested you on was typing skills, or what happened to your coordination, just what happens to you when you're drinking. And they didn't have any of what we would think of as modern diagnostic technologies, right? And they didn't have the imaging technologies. They barely had blood tests, right? So what I write about, the one study, they took this poor kid, this Harvard med student who volunteered, and basically every night he would show up in the lab, and they didn't have electrodes, so the electrodes were like these makeshift, gauze soaked in electrolyte solution, essentially connected to the reading. They'd wrap his wrists and ankles in those. They would basically kind of lock him in a coffin, like this thing where they could cycle all of his air and know what he was breathing, because they were doing metabolism, right? Mm-hmm. And then they would shove a tube into his rectum,
of course,
like you do. And some nights they would drip alcohol into there while he was asleep, and some nights they wouldn't. And then when he woke up the next day, they'd take him out of the coffin, let him go pee, basically, and then they would test to see what his responses were. Because it's really hard to find a placebo for alcohol. Right?
Because you can tell. If you have a drink with alcohol in it, you can tell.
Yes, almost all the time you can tell. Now, there are labs today where they finally figured out in the 70s, a researcher finally found a drink after, as he wrote, a lot of pleasant experimentation, that nobody could tell better than chance whether it had alcohol in it or not. And then you can use that in a setting like this. But until then, when they didn't have that, what do we do? It's like, well, basically, we're going to drip alcohol into this poor guy's butt and then see what happens.
So what did they find out? Did it impair his ability to perform?
Well, yes.
Okay.
I mean, they found out? Yeah, he's actually impaired the next day.
Turns out.
You probably shouldn't have too much to drink.
Good to know. Thank you so much, Adam.
My pleasure.
Proof is out now. Where can people find out more if they want to buy a copy of the book, whatever?
You can find out more on my website, which is adam-rogers.net. And it's sold on Amazon and on Barnes & Noble, and bookstores have it. You could go into a real one of those. Hopefully it's easy to find.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And we'll have more on Tested soon. See you guys later. Thanks.